Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 10 deeply unsettling tales from lonely small towns across America, places where the roads run out, the neighbors are few, and whatever lives in the spaces between the trees has been there far longer than any of us. These are accounts from people who wandered into those forgotten corners and found something waiting. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. The town of Harland Crossing sits at the end of a county road that most GPS systems don't even bother listing. I know because I drove past the turnoff 3 times before I finally spotted the rusted mailbox my aunt had described over the phone. There are maybe 40 people living out there, possibly fewer now. I honestly don't know, spread across properties so large you could go a whole week without seeing another face. When my grandmother passed and left me the old Dempsey house, my aunt kept saying things like, "You don't have to go out yourself, and we could just hire someone to clear it." I thought she was being overcautious. I was 31. I thought I understood things. The drive out from Columbus took longer than MapQuest suggested, which shouldn't have surprised me given that the last 20 miles were gravel. I remember the radio cutting to static somewhere around the old grain elevator, the one with the hand-painted cross on the silo that someone had added a second, upside-down cross beneath, which I told myself was just teenagers being teenagers. My coffee thermos had leaked slightly onto the passenger seat, and the car smelled like burnt hazelnut the whole way. I had a grocery bag from a gas station 2 towns back, granola bars, a bottle of water, one of those sad little sandwiches in a triangle container. I'd been planning this trip for 6 weeks and had managed to pack nothing useful. The Dempsey house was smaller than I remembered from childhood visits. Gray clapboard siding, a porch that sagged in the middle, a vegetable garden gone fully to seed along the south wall. The property backed up against a ridge of old-growth timber, beech and hickory mostly, dense enough that the tree line cast a shadow across the backyard even at 2 in the afternoon. My grandmother had lived there alone for 11 years after my grandfather died. I kept finding evidence of her routines: a coffee mug on the counter, a cardigan draped over the kitchen chair, her reading glasses folded on the Bible beside the bed. I felt guilty touching any of it. I spent the first afternoon making an inventory. The plan was to stay 2 nights, box up the important things, then arrange for an estate sale company to handle the rest. Simple, practical. I told myself I was being efficient when really I was trying not to think too hard about the fact that my grandmother had died alone in this house and nobody had found her for 4 days. The first night passed without incident mostly. I woke up once around 2 in the morning because I thought I heard something on the porch, a slow, rhythmic sound like a rocking chair moving. There was no rocking chair on that porch. I lay in bed and listened until it stopped, then told myself it was the wood settling, the way old houses do, the way I'd read they do. That felt reasonable. I went back to sleep. The second day I found the well. It was out past the vegetable garden, half hidden by the overgrowth of what had been a lilac hedge. Old stone construction, maybe 5 feet across, covered with a wooden lid that had warped and cracked over the years. I don't know why I lifted it. Curiosity, maybe, or that particular kind of restlessness that comes from being alone too long in a dead person's house. I heaved the lid aside and looked down, and the smell that came up was wrong in a way I can't fully articulate. Not rot, not stagnancy, but something older and more animal, like the inside of a burrow. And about 15 feet down, sitting on the stone ledge just above the waterline, there was a circle of small animal skulls, arranged very deliberately. 12 of them, all facing inward, the eye sockets aimed toward the center of the water. I told myself my grandmother had done it. Some old superstition, the kind rural people kept without being able to explain where they learned it. I replaced the lid. I went back inside and ate a granola bar and tried to remember if she'd ever seemed like the type to do something like that, and I couldn't remember, which bothered me more than I wanted to admit. That evening, I was packing boxes in the bedroom when I heard the screen door at the back of the house open and close. A soft, deliberate sound. I stood completely still for what felt like a full minute. Then I walked to the kitchen because that's where the back door was, and I told myself the latch had finally given. I'd noticed it was loose the day before. The door was closed, latched. I stood in the kitchen in the failing light and listened to the house around me. Nothing. I went back to the bedroom. I kept the kitchen light on. An hour later, I was sealing a box when I became aware that the light from the kitchen had changed. Dimmed slightly, as though something was standing in the doorway between the two rooms. I turned around. It was in the kitchen doorway, standing just at the edge of the light with its arms at its sides, and the first thing I registered, the thing that my brain snagged on before anything else, was that its hands were wrong. The fingers were too many. Not slightly too many, I counted before I could stop myself. 7 on each hand, long and slightly curled, and the extra fingers weren't misshapen, they weren't malformed, they looked intentional, like they'd always been exactly that way. The figure was the approximate height and shape of a person. It had dark hair, shoulder length. It was wearing something that might have been a dress or just cloth, draped loose over a frame that was thinner than it should have been under any circumstances. Its face was turned slightly away from me, as though it was looking at something on the kitchen counter. The way a person looks when they've just noticed something interesting. I did not move. My back was against the wall. My legs had stopped working in any useful way. It turned its head toward me, and its face there was something off about the proportions, the distance between the features, the jaw sitting not quite where a jaw should sit. And it opened its mouth, and my grandmother's voice came out. Not an approximation, her voice. The particular cadence she had when she was leaving a phone message, slightly formal, slightly uncertain. "I thought you were coming to help," it said. I grabbed my car keys off the nightstand. I don't know how, I don't remember deciding to. I went through the window. Literally through it, knocked the screen out, dropped 6 feet to the garden bed below, and I ran around the side of the house to my car and I drove. I drove back down the gravel road at a speed that should have killed me, and I didn't stop until I was back on the county highway with the lights of a gas station visible about 2 miles ahead. Here is what I found when I got back to Columbus and finally emptied my coat pockets. A button. Small, white, 4-hole. It wasn't from my coat. I don't own anything with buttons like that, but my grandmother had a cardigan hanging over the kitchen chair. I had looked at that cardigan on my first day there and thought about her wearing it, and I had not touched it. The button was in my pocket. I've had someone sell the property. I signed everything remotely. I've never been back to Harland Crossing, and I've never looked up whether the new owners found anything in that well. I think about it sometimes. I've decided not knowing is the better option. Story 2. You have to understand what Mineral Creek was like before you can understand why any of us stayed as long as we did. It's a mining town that stopped being a mining town about 40 years before I was born, which means by the time I was growing up there, it was mostly just a collection of habits that nobody had bothered to quit. About 300 people. 1 bar, 1 gas station, 1 church. The same 12 last names on most of the mailboxes. My family had been there since the 1880s, which in a place like that makes you practically ancient history. I was 19 when my older brother Cade talked me into spending a week at the Holt property. The Holt property was about 4 miles outside of town, up a fire road that the county had officially stopped maintaining sometime in the 90s. Old Chester Holt had died intestate, no will, no family, just a cabin and 35 acres of scrub timber that had been in legal limbo for years while the state figured out what to do with it. Cade had gotten it in his head that we could camp up there undisturbed for a week, fish the creek, drink beer, not think about anything. He was 23. He'd just lost a job he'd liked. He needed something to do with himself. I remember the drive up the fire road in his truck, a '98 Silverado with a crack in the windshield that he'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. The road was rough enough that my water bottle walked off the seat and disappeared somewhere in the footwell, and I couldn't find it without unbuckling, so I just left it. A deer stood at the tree line and watched us pass without moving. I noticed that, and then I forgot about it, which I've thought about since. The cabin was in better shape than I'd expected. A little musty, a few broken windows patched with cardboard but structurally solid. Someone had stacked firewood under the eaves recently enough that it was still dry. We didn't talk about that. Looking back, we probably should have. We set up the first day, got a fire going, fished the lower section of the creek and caught nothing. Cade burned the hot dogs. I'd brought a paperback I didn't end up reading. We went to bed early because there was nothing else to do once the sun went down. And the dark out there was the kind of dark that makes you realize how much ambient light you've been taking for granted your entire life. On the second morning, I went out to the creek before Cade woke up, maybe 5:30, maybe 6. The light was still gray and thin through the trees. The creek was maybe 30 yards from the cabin, and the path to it ran through a stand of young birch that had come up in what I guessed used to be a cleared area. I was about halfway through the birch when I stopped walking. Strung between the trees at roughly chest height were several lengths of wire. Not random wire, it had been twisted into specific shapes between the trees, shapes I couldn't name but that felt almost like letters in an alphabet I'd never seen. And hanging from the wire at intervals were small bundles, some of them plant matter, dried and bound with more wire, some of them things I couldn't immediately identify. It stretched for maybe 20 feet through the birch stand, and it had clearly been put there with intention and care. I told myself it was old Chester Holt or someone before him doing something superstitious or artistic or both, folk art, something like that. I stepped around it carefully and kept going to the creek, but I thought about it all morning. By afternoon, the feeling had settled into a kind of low-grade unease that I kept trying to shake. I told Cade about the wire. He went and looked at it and said it was weird and then said nothing more about it, which was his way. We ate lunch. The sun went behind clouds around 2 and didn't come back out. The temperature dropped faster than it should have. That evening I was sitting outside while Cade washed the dishes. We'd established a rotation, don't ask me why, it just seemed civilized, when I noticed something at the far edge of the clearing. The light was going but not gone, that thick amber hour before real dark. There was a shape at the tree line that wasn't a tree. It was roughly person-shaped, but standing utterly still in a way that people don't stand when they're just looking at something. It was the stillness of something that didn't need to perform patience because patience was simply its natural state. I called Cade's name. He came out. By the time he got to the door, the shape was gone. He said I was spooked by the wire. I said maybe. We kept the fire going late that night, which meant we were both awake when the sound started. Around midnight, from somewhere in the trees to the north of the cabin, maybe 40 yards out, there was a sound that I can only describe as an exhalation. Not one exhalation, several at irregular intervals, like something breathing out slowly and deliberately. Not an animal, or not any animal I'd ever heard. Cade got the flashlight. I got the camp axe, which in retrospect was the kind of decision that makes more sense in the moment than it does in hindsight. We stood on the porch and shone the light into the trees and saw nothing. The sound stopped. Whine through a hollow log, Cade said. Maybe, I said. We both went back inside without another word. Around 3 in the morning, something touched the outside of the cabin wall just beside my head. I was lying on my sleeping bag on the floor, and my head was maybe 8 inches from the wall. Whatever made contact with the other side was not wind, was not a branch, was not a settling timber. It was a slow, deliberate pressure moving downward along the outside of the wall, and the sound it made was a sound that I felt in my chest before I heard it with my ears. I lay completely rigid until it stopped. In the morning, Cade and I packed the truck without discussion. Neither of us suggested staying. We drove back down the fire road, and I remember watching the tree line as we passed the birch stand, half expecting to see the wire had been changed or moved. It had been changed. The bundles were gone, every single one stripped cleanly from the wire which still hung there between the trees empty. We never talked about what made that sound. We stopped talking about that trip in general by mutual unspoken agreement sometime around the second year after. Cade lives in Phoenix now. I visited him once and we had dinner, and at one point he looked out the restaurant window at nothing in particular and said, "I never should have taken you up there," and then changed the subject. I let him. Some things are better left alone. Story 3. Growing up in Sawyer's Mill, you had the option of ignoring the marsh or being afraid of it. Those were really the only two settings available. Most people chose ignoring because it was easier and because you had to live there, and the marsh was pretty much always visible from the eastern end of town, sitting out there between the road and the river like something that hadn't been invited but had stayed anyway. My name is Priya Holloway, and I made the mistake of choosing a third option when I was 24. I went into it. I was finishing my degree in environmental science, and I needed field hours for a wetlands survey project that my professor had generously described as flexible in its geographic parameters, which meant I could essentially go anywhere. I'd been avoiding Sawyer's Mill Marsh my whole life on purely social grounds. It was the kind of thing you didn't do in our town, the way you didn't park at the old Dellinger lot after dark or swim in the reservoir, even though nobody would give you a concrete reason why not. But I needed hours and the marsh was right there, and I figured whatever childhood dread I'd been carrying about the place was exactly that, childhood dread. I went on a Tuesday, or Wednesday. I think it was Wednesday, actually, because I remember the bakery on Main had the bear claws out, which they only did on Wednesdays, and I grabbed one on my way through town. I had my hip waders, my sampling kits, my field notebook with the coffee stain on the cover from the previous semester. I had bug spray that I'd applied too liberally and could still taste at the back of my throat. The access point was a rusted gate off Route 7 that opened onto what had probably been a farm track at some point and was now just 2 tire ruts through the grass. I parked there and walked in. The marsh in person wasn't scary exactly. It was quiet in a way that felt thick, like the air had weight. The reeds were tall, 7 or 8 feet in places, and the ground was soft enough that each footstep made a wet compression sound, a small sucking noise. There were birds at first, red-winged blackbirds in the reeds, calling back and forth. I noted them in my book. About an hour in, the birds stopped, not gradually. One moment they were there, the usual scattered calls, and then they were complete silence except for my own footsteps and the small wet sounds of the marsh settling around me. I told myself weather change, sometimes birds go quiet before a shift in pressure. That was a real thing. I checked the sky. It was flat and gray and uniformly uninformative. I kept going because I had 4 hours of work to finish before the light changed, and also because stopping felt, weirdly, more frightening than continuing. I found the first marker about 20 minutes into the silence, a stake driven into the mud, topped with what looked like a bundle of dried reeds bound with cord. I almost walked past it. There was another one 10 yards further on, and another beyond that. They formed a line, curving gradually, and without consciously deciding to, I had begun following them. I should explain here that I knew what survey markers looked like. These were not survey markers. The line of stakes led me to a small island of higher ground, maybe 30 feet across, where the reeds thinned and the mud gave way to actual soil. and on that ground there was a structure, not a building, nothing that elaborate, but a deliberate construction of stacked stones and waterlogged wood that formed 3 walls of something, maybe 4 feet high, open on the eastern side. Inside it, piled with a care that was somehow worse than carelessness, were bones. Fish bones mostly, I thought at first, but there were larger ones mixed in. I didn't examine them closely. I didn't want to know. Sitting at the entrance to the structure, so fresh that the mud around it hadn't yet fully dried, was a single clear handprint, human-shaped, fingers longer than they should be on a human hand, pressed deliberately as though someone had sat down and placed their hand flat against the earth with the same intention you'd do signing your name. I rationalized this for about 30 seconds. Erosion shaping mud into something that looked like a handprint. An unusual root system pushing up from below. A child with no, it was a handprint. I knew what a handprint looked like. What I should have done was leave immediately. Instead, I stood there doing what I can only call stalling, writing measurements in my notebook that I wasn't really seeing, because some part of my brain had decided that if I just stayed calm and behaved normally, the rest of the world would also stay calm and behave normally. Then I heard breathing, not the sounds of the marsh, not wind. Breathing, slow, just slightly too deliberate from somewhere in the reeds to my left. Close, 10 feet, maybe less. The reeds in that direction were moving in a way that wasn't wind, a slow parting that tracked from south to north, and whatever was causing it was low to the ground or crouched, or I did not wait to determine which. I ran, straight back along the stake line because it was the only navigational reference I had, and the alternative was getting turned around in 8-foot reeds in a marsh where nobody knew I was. The mud grabbed at my boots. I fell once, caught myself on my palms, got back up. The sound in the reeds was not following me, or if it was keeping pace at a consistent distance, which was somehow worse, because it implied no urgency on its part. I hit the farm track at a run, got to my car, drove back through town with my hands shaking on the wheel, mud drying on my jacket, the bear claw bag still in the passenger seat. Here is the part I've never told anyone in full. 3 days later, I got my photographs back from the field. I'd been using a disposable camera. The digital on my phone was broken. It's a whole other story. One of the photographs, taken about 45 minutes into the survey, while I was still doing legitimate work and before anything strange had happened, shows me crouching over a sample jar. Behind me, visible between 2 clumps of reeds, is a shape. Low to the ground, as I said, or crouched, pale. The face, if it is a face, is turned toward the camera, toward me. There is no feature I can identify with certainty, but the image is clear enough that I can see the reeds on either side of it are bent, curved inward, as though 2 enormous hands are parting them to look through. It was there before I heard anything. I turned in my field hours from a different site. I have not gone back to Sawyer's Mill Marsh. I have not shown that photograph to anyone because I'm not sure what I would do if someone told me I was wrong about what I saw. Story 4. My family's connection to Bulmont Hollow goes back far enough that I grew up hearing about it in a way that felt like hearing about a distant relative, someone present in the family history, but not someone you'd bring up casually at dinner. The hollow is about 8 miles outside of Garrett, Tennessee, a gap between 2 ridges where the sun only reaches for a few hours each day, and the soil is so dense with clay that nothing grows tall or straight. People homesteaded out there in the 1800s. People left eventually. The homesteads stayed, or what remained of them did. I went out there the summer I was 27 because my father had mentioned almost in passing that the old ranch cabin his mother's people, 4 generations back, was still standing technically. Could be worth seeing, he said, in the tone of someone who neither wanted to go himself nor wanted to explicitly tell me not to go. I had a week between jobs. I thought it would be something to do. I packed light, sleeping bag, camping stove, the kind of supplies you take for 2 or 3 days just in case. My truck was running fine except for an intermittent rattle from the glove box that I kept thinking I'd fixed and hadn't. I drove through Garrett around noon and stopped at the filling station, where the man behind the counter asked where I was headed, and when I told him, said nothing for a moment and then said, "You have people out there?" I said something like yes, or something like I used to. He nodded and sold me a Coke and didn't say anything else. The ranch cabin was harder to find than I'd expected. The old access road had been reclaimed almost entirely by undergrowth, dogwood and sumac mostly, forced close together so that driving through them meant accepting a certain amount of paint damage. I got the truck about a mile in before the ruts got too deep and just walked the rest of the way. The cabin was stone and log construction, which explained why it was still standing. The roof had mostly held. The windows were long gone. The fireplace at the east end was intact, which struck me as melancholy in a way I couldn't articulate right away. All this structural permanence and nothing to show for it, just cold stone. I spent the afternoon clearing enough of the interior to set up my sleeping bag, which involved moving a considerable amount of debris, old shelf boards, a rusted cookstove leg, raccoon scat that I tried not to think about. I found a cast iron pot half buried in the corner, which I moved outside without examining further. By the time I'd eaten and the light was going, I had something that felt almost like a campsite if you were generous in your interpretation. The hollow was very quiet at night, not peaceful quiet, more like the absence of sound that you get in a room that's just been vacuumed, weirdly artificial. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to it and finally fell asleep, though I don't remember the exact moment, the way you never do. What woke me was the smell. Sometime after midnight, I checked my watch. It was 1:17, which is a specific detail I have for no good reason. There was a smell in the cabin that hadn't been there before. Deeply organic, like turned soil after heavy rain, but underneath it something sharper, something that reminded me of the smell you get opening a jar of iron nails. I lay still and breathed through my mouth. The smell intensified and then slowly faded. I told myself groundwater, the clay, the creek somewhere below releasing gases at night. These things happened. I had read about them. I went back to sleep. In the morning, I walked the property and found the creek, and spent some time sketching the cabin's dimensions in a notebook I'd brought, the way I'd told my father I might. I was in the clearing south of the cabin around mid-morning when I noticed the tree. It was a large beech, maybe 70 years old, at the edge of the clearing. What had caught my eye was the bark. Beeches have smooth gray bark that people carve into sometimes, and I'd half expected to find old initials, the kind of thing homesteaders did. What I found instead was different. Starting at about head height and continuing upward for 6 or 7 feet, the bark had been pressed inward, not carved, pressed, as though something had rested its weight against the tree at multiple points up its length. The impressions were deep enough to have damaged the cambium. They were spaced irregularly. They were not hand-shaped. I stood and looked at them for a while, trying to work out what could have done that. A bear, maybe. Bears rubbed against trees. But bear marks were scratches, not smooth impressions. These were smooth. These were the shapes of something pressing against the bark from the outside, something that had moved upward along the tree by degrees. I stayed the second night because leaving felt like admitting I was scared, which I was. The second night was worse. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a sound directly above the cabin on the roof, or just above it, a slow, sliding friction, like something repositioning its weight, dragging itself across the remaining shingles. I counted my breaths. The sound moved from the south end to the north end over the course of about 4 minutes, which is too slow for anything that moves quickly and far too deliberate for the wind. Then it stopped. I saw it at dawn. I was outside at first light, standing at the tree line to the east, and it was coming out of the canopy above the trail I'd walked in on. Not climbing down, descending as though the vertical surface of the tree were simply another direction available to it. Face down, arms and legs spread wide in a configuration I cannot square with human anatomy, no matter how many times I've tried. It reached the ground and straightened, and it was tall, taller than any person I've encountered, and it stood with its back to me for a moment that felt very long. Then it walked into the tree line and was gone, and the only thing left was the morning light coming through the canopy and my own heartbeat so loud I could hear it in my ears. I left everything. Sleeping bag, camp stove, that cast iron pot I'd moved outside. I walked the mile back through the sumac at a pace just controlled enough to keep my footing, got in my truck and left. When I got back to Garrett, the filling station was open. I stopped, not because I needed gas. The same man was behind the counter. He looked at me for a moment and said, "Get what you came for?" I said I didn't know. He nodded like that was a satisfactory answer. My father asked how it went when I got home. I said the cabin was mostly intact, which was true. I didn't say anything else, and he didn't push, and I've always wondered if that meant he already knew. Story 5. The summer I turned 22, I somehow convinced myself that taking a photography job in Elk Tooth, Montana was a reasonable thing to do. Elk Tooth is not a remarkable place. 1,200 people, give or take, sitting in a high valley between mountains that look close enough to touch on clear days and disappear entirely when the weather comes in. I'd found the job through a listing. A local paper needed someone to cover the county fair, the rodeo, some civic event or another. It paid poorly. I went anyway because I'd spent the previous year in Chicago and wanted the opposite of Chicago, and Elk Tooth seemed like a reasonable definition of opposite. I rented a room from a woman named Gerta Lindqvist, who ran a boarding house on the north end of town. She was in her late 60s, Norwegian-American, deeply practical about most things. She showed me where the towels were and told me which burner on the stove ran hot and mentioned, without particular emphasis, that I should be careful if I was going to drive the East Road after dark, especially near the old Reinhold property. I asked why. She said, "Just better not to," in the same tone she'd used to describe the hot burner, and I noted it and moved on. The job was fine. The county fair was fine. I photographed a lot of livestock and baked goods and children in 4-H uniforms, and I spent my evenings in the boarding house reading, or walking the main street, or sitting on the wide front porch watching the mountains go dark. I'd bought a local guidebook from the gift shop, the kind of thin, staple-bound thing produced by a chamber of commerce, and I was working my way through the hiking section, making plans I mostly didn't execute. About 3 weeks in, I drove the East Road after dark. I have a reason, which is that I'd been out photographing an evening rodeo event and was coming back a different way than usual, and I didn't realize I'd turned onto the East Road until I'd been on it for 10 minutes. I wasn't lost. I knew where I was. I just hadn't been paying attention to my route the way I should have been. By the time I put it together, I was a good ways in, and it seemed more sensible to continue than to turn around. The Reinhold property was visible from the road, a farmhouse set well back from the tree line, dark windows, the remnants of a barn off to one side that had collapsed in on itself at some point and never been cleared. A rusted swing set in the yard, which was somehow the most unsettling thing about it, just by virtue of being unexpected. I slowed down a little without meaning to. I don't know why my foot eased off the gas. Something in the way the property sat there. The absence of anything growing immediately around the house, like the ground had retreated. I passed it and kept going, and that would have been the whole story except that my headlights caught something at the edge of the road about 200 yards past the property line. It was a dog, or it was shaped like a dog. The posture was right, the height was right. But when my lights hit it, it didn't react the way a dog reacts. It didn't flinch or shy away or crouch. It turned its head toward my headlights and just looked, and the wrongness of it was in the way the head turned. Too far, past the angle a dog's head turns, past the angle any animal's head turns without involving the full body, just the head, rotating like something on a spindle, too smooth, too far. I drove past it, faster than I should have, and glanced in the rear-view mirror. It was in the road behind me, sitting on its haunches, watching my taillights. Still that same wrong posture. Still that head at the impossible angle. I didn't slow down. I got back to Goethe's boarding house and sat in my car in the driveway for 5 minutes before I went inside. She was in the kitchen when I came through the door, and she looked at me the way people look at you when they already know something and have been waiting for it to become relevant, and she said, "Saw something on the East Road." I said yes. She made tea. We sat at the kitchen table, and she did not explain anything, which I've come to understand was a kindness, because explaining things like that never makes them less frightening and sometimes makes them worse. She said that the Reinhold family had left sometime in the 1960s, and the property had been officially vacant ever since. She said some places keep something they were never meant to keep. She said, "Don't go back out there." I didn't. I gave Gerda notice and was back in Chicago 6 weeks earlier than planned. Here's the thing that I still think about. When I developed the roll of film from that evening, the rodeo shots, which turned out well, I found 4 photographs at the end of the roll that I have no memory of taking. Each one is a blurry, slightly overexposed image of a section of road seen through a car windshield. Night, my headlights catching the asphalt. In the 4th photograph, at the upper right edge of the frame, there is a shape, low to the ground at the roadside. The head is turned toward the camera. I have never put a different roll of film in that camera. I don't understand where those 4 shots came from, and I've stopped trying to. Story 6. I want to be upfront about something. I went to Vernal Basin because I was running from something, and I think whatever was in those woods knew it. I'm not being mystical about that. I just think that when you're already off balance, when your defenses are already down, you don't make the smart calls. And I made a lot of not smart calls that week. My marriage had ended in March. It's now October, years later, and I can say that without it meaning too much. But at the time, I needed to be somewhere that felt nothing like the apartment I'd shared with my ex-wife. And someone had mentioned Vernal Basin, a small community in northern New Mexico, maybe 400 people, mostly retirees and artists and people who decided at some point to stop leaving. The town sat at the edge of a nature preserve, and I'd gotten a short-term rental through a listing that seemed too cheap to be real and turned out to be exactly as advertised. A studio attached to an old adobe property, entirely functional, entirely isolated, surrounded by high desert scrub that stretched to the mountains in every direction. I arrived on a Sunday, I think. I spent the first 2 days doing absolutely nothing productive, which was the point. I drove into town once for groceries. The woman at the market, small woman, maybe 70, hair gone fully white, name tag said Florentia Scenes, bagged my groceries and asked if I was staying at the Mirabelle rental. I said yes. She said, "You'll hear coyotes at night, don't be frightened, just don't follow the sound if it moves toward the arroyos." She said it in the same matter-of-fact way you tell someone where the recycling bins were. I said okay. I thought she was being colorful. I put my groceries in the car and drove back to the adobe. I heard coyotes that night. Lots of places in New Mexico you hear coyotes. It's not unusual. I noted it and went back to sleep. On the 3rd night, the coyote sound moved. I don't know how else to describe it. I woke up around midnight to the sound coming from the north, the desert side, away from the town, and then over the course of 20 minutes or so, it migrated. South, then southeast, then directly below my window, then silent. Coyotes moved. I knew this. Coyotes ranged widely, they weren't stationary. I lay in bed and told myself that and almost believed it. What I couldn't rationalize was the quality of the sound. Real coyotes were erratic, yipping and falling silent at random, overlapping calls and responses from multiple animals. This was one sound, one source, moving with a continuity that felt too intentional, like a lure dragged slowly across a floor. I didn't follow it. I want to be clear about that. I did not follow it. But the next evening, walking the property at dusk because I'd been inside too long, I found the arroyo. It cut through the scrub about a quarter-mile east of the adobe, a deep-cut channel, maybe 8 feet down, carved by water that wasn't running now. The light at the bottom was dim, and the arroyo wound south along the base of a small ridge, and I stood at the edge looking down at it, and something about it pulled at me in a way I didn't like standing at a great height and feeling the involuntary lean. I stepped back from the edge. There was someone at the bottom of the arroyo. Standing in the dry channel bed, maybe 30 feet south of where I stood, was a figure. Slender, still, facing away from me. The light was going fast, so I couldn't make out detail beyond the shape, the particular stillness of it, the way it was just slightly too present, too solid, for something I was seeing at the bottom of a shadow-filled ditch at near dark. I called out something like, "Hey," or "Hello," the kind of reflexive social noise you make when you're not sure what else to do. It turned around. The face, I don't want to say too much about the face, because the face is the part I've spent the most energy not thinking about, and I'm worried that describing it too precisely will put it back in high definition in a way I'd rather avoid. What I'll say is that it was proportioned wrong in a way that made me think immediately and involuntarily of the coyote sound I'd heard the night before. There was something about the jaw, the way it sat, something that didn't match what the rest of the face suggested a jaw should look like on a thing that was structured the way this was structured. It raised one hand, not a wave, a gesture, slow and deliberate with a quality of invitation. Come down. I was already walking backward before I was conscious of deciding to. I got back to the adobe. I locked the door, which felt absurd and also felt necessary. I called Florentia at the market. I'd kept the receipt. She was listed as a community contact. And she picked up after 2 rings, and when I described what I'd seen, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Don't open the door if you hear the coyotes again tonight." "What is it?" I asked. She was quiet again. Then she said, "In the morning, come to the market. In the morning, it's fine." I didn't sleep. I heard the coyote sound twice more, once moving from the east and once directly below the south window, and I didn't open the door. At dawn, I drove to town, and Florentia made me coffee, and she never told me what she knew, and I've come to respect that she had her reasons. I checked out of the Mirabelle rental that morning. I drove south until I hit the highway, and I didn't stop until Albuquerque. When I unpacked in the motel room in Albuquerque, I found that my field notebook, the one I'd been keeping personal notes in that week, private things, nothing related to the desert or the walk or any of it, had 3 pages at the back that I hadn't written. The handwriting wasn't mine. The letters formed words I didn't recognize in any language I could identify. The pages were dry, but when I held one close, there was something gritty about the surface of the paper, like fine sand had been pressed into the fibers. Like someone had been holding it with hands that had been in dry clay. Story 7. My grandmother on my father's side had a saying that I didn't understand until I was an adult. Some doors were made to lock from the outside. She was from a small town called Cutter's Ford in eastern Oregon, and when she said things like that, she meant them as practical advice rather than poetry. She'd grown up near the old Voss Grange, which was a community hall that had been decommissioned sometime in the 40s for reasons nobody in Cutter's Ford would articulate directly. It sat on a gravel road at the edge of town, padlocked, boards over the windows, slowly subsiding into the ground. I was 29 when I broke into it. I need you to understand that I'm not proud of this. I'm a structural engineer. I had professional interest in the building. It was late era craftsman vernacular, better built than most things from that period in rural Oregon, and I'd been driving past it for 3 days of a regional survey project, and the lock on the padlock was older than I was and not in great shape. I told myself it was a professional visit. My colleague on the survey was a woman named Adrienne Walsh, who declined to come in with me and stood by the rental car with her coffee and made a point of checking her watch. I'm including this because Adrienne is important to the end of the story. The interior of the Voss Grange was one large open space, the main hall, with a kitchen attached at the rear and 2 smaller rooms off the north wall, doors closed. The floor was intact, except for a soft spot near the kitchen doorway, which I noted and marked in my field notebook. The ceiling was high, the original exposed beam construction, and despite 40+ years of vacancy, the building was structurally sounder than I'd expected. I moved through it methodically, making notes and measurements. The 2 rooms off the north wall were locked, not padlocked, locked from the outside, the handles fitted with deadbolts that opened from the hallway side, not from within. I noticed this and noted it in my book without thinking too hard about the implication. My grandmother's voice was not in my head at that moment. I wish it had been. I'm not entirely sure what happened after that, and I want to be honest about that uncertainty. I was in the main hall, near the south end, and I was writing a measurement in my notebook, and then I was aware that I was no longer alone in the building. Not through sound, not through sight, just through a certainty that arrived without evidence, the way you sometimes know you've made a wrong turn before you've processed the street signs. The certainty was specific. Whatever else was in the building was behind one of those locked doors, and it had been there for a long time, and it was aware that I was also there. I forced myself to finish the measurement. This was probably a mistake. I wrote the number and capped my pen and started toward the entrance. One of the doors opened. I heard the mechanism, the soft mechanical click of a latch, the slight creak of a door swinging on hinges that hadn't moved in years. And in the space between the time I registered the sound and the time I could make myself turn around to look, I heard breathing, not shallow or quick. Slow and deep and even, the breathing of something that had been very still for a very long time and was now readjusting. When I turned, the door was open about 8 inches, and the room beyond it was dark, and I could see nothing inside it. The breathing was coming from the dark, and within the breathing there was something else, a sound like words, but not words in any configuration I could parse, a rhythm without language, a cadence that my ear kept trying to resolve into meaning and couldn't. I walked out of the Grange without running, which was a deliberate act of self-control I'm genuinely proud of even now, and I relatched the padlock behind me, and when Adrienne looked up from her coffee and said, "Done," I said yes and got into the passenger seat and did not look back at the building as we pulled away. I told Adrienne what I'd heard. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Did you open either of those locked doors?" I said no. Both had been locked from the outside. She said, "Good," and nothing more, and I didn't ask how she had known about the doors. The aftermath proof arrived 2 days later when I was reviewing my survey photographs on my laptop. I had 47 photographs of the Grange interior. In photograph 31, taken from the south end of the hall facing north, the 2 doors on the north wall are visible. Both doors are closed. This photograph was taken at approximately the midpoint of my visit. In photograph 32, taken from the same position, one of the doors is open, approximately 8 inches. The room beyond is dark. In the doorway, at roughly knee height, there is a hand. Pale, flat against the door frame, fingers spread as if testing the edge of the opening. I had not opened that door. I have not driven past Cutter's Ford since. Story 8. I need to start by saying that my brother-in-law Diego Reyes is a skeptic about basically everything, and even Diego agrees that what happened at Piper Lake does not have a clean explanation. I mention this because I know how the story sounds. I've told it enough times to watch people's faces do the thing where they're trying to decide whether to seem politely credulous or gently dismissive, and it gets old. Diego was there. Diego is a structural skeptic. Diego will not talk about Piper Lake. Piper Lake is in a stretch of northern Minnesota that still gets called the Iron Range, though the mines have mostly been quiet for decades. Small communities out there, each one anchored to a specific bend in a specific road, each one with a gas station and a church, and a sense of being slightly outside the awareness of the rest of the world. My sister Natalie and Diego had rented a lake cabin there for a week in late September. Their idea of a vacation was apparently watching the aspens turn from a porch while drinking coffee, and they'd invited me along because the cabin had 3 bedrooms and I was between situations in a way that made a free vacation appealing. I'm Rosario, by the way, Rosario Fuentes. I'm 35 now. I was 29 when this happened. I drove up from Minneapolis in about 4 hours and got in late enough that Natalie had left a plate of food covered in foil on the counter and gone to bed. And Diego was still up watching a game with the sound low. And we nodded at each other the way in-laws do when they're being diplomatic, and I went to bed. The cabin was on a lake, Piper Lake, obviously. That was about a mile across and mostly surrounded by second-growth forest, birch and poplar, and the occasional stand of old pine that had somehow been missed by the logging operations. The cabin was well-maintained, newer than it looked. It had a dock that extended 20 feet into the water, and the neighbor property to the north was about a quarter mile away through the trees, visible only when the wind cleared the foliage enough to show a roofline. The first 3 days were completely normal. We rented kayaks and paddled the lake. Natalie made elaborate breakfasts that Diego and I didn't deserve. I read on the porch in the afternoons and watched the aspens do exactly what Diego had described. The nights were cold and clear, and the stars over the lake were the kind you forget exist if you spend too long in a city. On the 4th day, I walked the North Trail. The North Trail was a marked path that ran along the lake shore and looped back through the forest, about 3 miles total. Natalie had done it once. Diego had done it and complained about the mud. I went out around 2 in the afternoon with the idea of making it back in time for dinner, which left plenty of margin. A mile and a half in, I found the canoe. It was pulled up on the bank, 100 feet or so off the trail, tucked under the overhang of a large pine. Old aluminum construction, dented and weathered, nothing unusual about its existence out here except that it had been placed too deliberately, not dragged up and left, but positioned, oriented bow first toward the water, paddles laid parallel inside it, as if someone had staged it to be used immediately. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked at the trees around it. There was nobody visible, but there were tracks. In the soft mud between the pine and the water, there were footprints, coming from the water, starting at the shoreline, leading up to the canoe, stopping, just stopping. No prints led away from the canoe in any direction. Someone had walked out of the lake, up to the canoe, and then, what? Gotten into it. The canoe was clearly empty, flown away. The prints just ended, 2 feet from the stern, in a patch of mud that had no further marks on it in any direction. I told myself the person had gotten into the canoe and I was misreading the tracking. I told myself maybe the top layer of mud had dried and the outgoing prints weren't visible. I told myself a lot of things. I walked back to the cabin faster than I'd walked out. I didn't mention it to Natalie and Diego. I said the trail was nice. I ate my dinner and watched the lake and tried not to think about those tracks. That night I woke up at some point, I didn't check my watch, to a sound on the lake, Rhythmic, soft, mechanical paddling. Someone paddling on the lake directly in front of the cabin in the dark at what had to be 2 or 3 in the morning. I went to the window and looked out. The lake was dark and flat and still. The dock was empty. There was no canoe on the water. And the paddling sound continued for another 30 seconds, then stopped. I don't know which is worse, the sound or the fact that there was nothing making it. On our last morning, Diego went down to the dock early to drink his coffee. He came back in within 5 minutes, moving faster than Diego usually moved. He set his mug down on the counter without drinking from it and said, "Don't go down to the dock." Natalie asked why. He said, "There's something on the dock I don't want to look at." We looked at it anyway together from the cabin window. Someone had placed a length of aluminum canoe paddle, just a length, cut cleanly on the dock overnight. It was laid across the boards at the dock's midpoint. Around it, pressed into the slight weathering of the wood, were wet marks in a shape I kept trying to resolve into coincidence and couldn't. Palms and not fingers exactly. More pressure points where fingers would be if fingers spread wider than they should. We checked out that morning. Diego has not commented on the paddle or the marks or the paddling sounds since. If you asked him about Piper Lake, I believe he would say the cabin was fine. He'd be technically correct. I just don't think technically correct covers it. Story 9. I was the one who wanted to stop in Pharaoh, which means I'm the one who has to live with what happened there. I want to be clear about that because it wouldn't be fair to put any of this on Marcus Chen, who was just along for the drive and had no particular opinion about Pharaoh one way or the other. It was a road trip. Marcus and I had been friends since high school. We were both 26 at the time. And we decided to drive from Charlotte to Seattle over 2 weeks, taking state roads instead of interstates. The kind of trip where you stop whenever something looks interesting and eat at diners instead of chains. Pharaoh, West Virginia is not a place that announces itself as interesting. It's a mountain town of maybe 200 people sitting in a narrow valley between slopes dense with second-growth oak, connected to the rest of the world by a 2-lane highway that followed the creek. We stopped because we'd been driving for 6 hours and needed coffee, and the gas gauge was drifting toward empty. The gas station was run by a man who introduced himself as Len, which felt like a name that went with Pharaoh in a way that seemed entirely authentic. Len sold us coffee that was better than it had any right to be and pointed us toward a diner 2 blocks up, where we ate sandwiches and eavesdropped on the conversation at the next table. 2 older men talking about a property dispute in a language dense with local history that we couldn't follow, but that seemed genuinely interesting in the way of things that are none of your business. We were going to leave. That was the plan. Instead, I walked out of the diner and turned left instead of right, and found myself looking up a narrow side street at what appeared to be a town park. Just a few acres of mowed grass and old trees, a bandstand, the kind of civic space that small mountain towns kept going on pure civic momentum. It was late afternoon, and the light was that flat gold that happens in valleys when the sun is low but not yet down. And it looked beautiful, and I said to Marcus, "Walk with me for 20 minutes." Said sure. He had a second coffee in a to-go cup. I had my camera. The park was quiet. A few trees were starting to turn. This was early October, and the bandstand had obviously seen better decades, the paint peeling and one of the decorative railings gone. I took some photographs. We walked through to the far end where the park bordered the forest, and there was an old iron fence marking the boundary, ornamental, the kind of fence that was more about marking the line than keeping anything in or out. There was a gap in the fence, and beyond the gap, a path. Not an official path, no marker, no sign, just a worn line through the undergrowth that suggested use over time. I looked down it and could see maybe 30 feet before it curved. I said, "Just a few minutes." Marcus said, "It's getting dark." I said, "5 minutes." He came with me, and I will never stop feeling guilty about that. The path wound uphill through dense oak for about 200 yards. The light was fading quickly, as it does in narrow valleys, the way the dark comes from above and below simultaneously. We didn't talk much. I was taking photographs, not particularly focused on anything, just the automatic response to interesting light in an interesting place. Around the curve, the path opened slightly into a shallow depression, not a clearing, just a brief widening. The trees set a little farther back, and in the center of the depression was a stone. A large, flat-topped stone, maybe 4 feet across, worn smooth in a way that I noticed before I noticed what was on it. On the stone, arranged in a pattern that was too careful to be accidental, were teeth. Human teeth, I believe, though I'm not an expert and I've tried not to become one. Perhaps 40 or 50 of them, arranged outward from the center of the stone in lines that radiated like a sunburst or a compass rose. They were old, yellowed, and dry. Some of them were back molars, some incisors. They were not all from the same person. Marcus looked at them for a moment and then said, "We need to go." He was right, and I knew it, and I took one photograph anyway, because I am who I am, and then I put my camera down and we both turned back toward the path. Something was standing on the path behind us. I saw it for maybe 3 seconds before it moved back into the undergrowth. And what I saw in those 3 seconds was a person, approximately, except for the quality of its stillness, which was absolute in a way that bodies in motion cannot achieve even momentarily. It was dressed in something dark, or its surface was dark, and it was not tall, not short, but its posture was wrong in a way that I keep coming back to but can't precisely name, like something assembled with too much accuracy from a description of how people stood without ever having seen one do it. It had no visible face in the failing light. Or there was a face, but nothing about it resolved into the features I expected features to occupy. It stepped backward and the undergrowth closed around it and it was gone. We ran, the full 200 yards back to the fence through the gap across the park. We were breathing hard when we got back to the car. We drove out of Pharaoh at a speed that I'm glad Len didn't witness. Neither of us spoke for about an hour. When I got the photos from that walk-developed digital camera, I reviewed them in the motel that night. The photograph I'd taken of the stone was there. The teeth were clearly visible, laid out in their radiating pattern. The photograph taken immediately before it, which I'd taken pointing back along the path from the stone, showed the path behind us. There was no one on it. The photograph taken immediately after, the one I took just before I put the camera down and turned to leave, showed the path as well, from a different angle, as though the camera had shifted slightly. I do not remember taking that photograph, and at the far edge of the frame, barely at the boundary of the image, there is a shape in the undergrowth. Dark. Still, I did not take that photograph. My finger was not on the shutter. I have reviewed this many times and I have not been able to explain it. Marcus lives in Denver now. He called me last year on the anniversary, the first year he'd ever acknowledged the anniversary, and said, "Do you still have those photos?" I said I did. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay," and changed the subject. I've been thinking about that call ever since. I'm not sure what he was going to say if I'd answered differently. Story 10. The last thing I expected when I took the ranger internship at Hollow Pines was to come home with something I couldn't shake. I was 24, just finished with a forestry degree, and the posting in Hollow Pines, Utah felt like a gift. Seasonal work in a national forest, monitoring trail conditions and wildlife corridors, the kind of hands-in-the-dirt work I'd been building toward for 4 years. The town of Hollow Pines itself was maybe 300 people, clustered at the valley floor, the kind of place where the supermarket doubled as the hardware store and the one sit-down restaurant closed at 7. The ranger station was staffed by a supervisor named Walt Deering, who was in his 50s, and who gave me the orientation in the form of a drive around the district in a truck that smelled like chain oil and old coffee. He pointed out the key trail junctions, the seasonal creek crossings, the areas with historically active wildlife. When we came to the northern boundary of the district, a ridgeline trail called the Jepsen Loop, he noted it and kept driving without slowing, and when I asked about it, he said, "We check the Jepsen every 2 weeks, not more frequently." I asked why. He said, "Trail condition," which was clearly not the whole answer. I was 3 weeks into the internship when I was assigned the Jepsen Loop inspection. It was an October morning, cold and clear, the aspens on the lower slopes already gone golden. I parked at the trailhead and signed in on the register and started up. The Jepsen was 8 miles round trip, rising to a ridge that looked out over 3 valleys, and I was carrying a clipboard, a trail assessment form, and one of those handheld GPS units that looked like it had been issued somewhere around 2008. It worked, mostly. The first 4 miles were unremarkable. Nice trail, honestly well graded, the kind of elevation gain that was work but not punishment. I noted a washout at mile 2 that needed flagging, a downed tree at 3.5 that would require a crew with a chainsaw, standard stuff. I ate half a granola bar somewhere around mile 4 sitting on a rock overlook, watching a hawk work the thermals below the ridge. The sky was very blue. I was entirely contented. The unremarkable part ended around mile 5. The trail there followed the actual ridgeline for about a quarter mile before descending back into the trees, and there was a rocky outcrop on the west side with a view that was presumably the payoff for the whole climb. I was crossing that exposed section when I became aware that the wind had stopped completely. This happens. Winds shift, lulls occur. I noted it and kept walking. The GPS unit in my hand went blank. Not dead. The battery indicator was fine. It just went blank, the screen showing nothing, no map, no coordinates, and then after about 15 seconds it came back displaying what I'm fairly confident were wrong coordinates. A location that, when I checked later, was not on the trail or near it, but about 6 miles to the east. I shook the unit. The screen went blank again. I pocketed it and kept going because that was my job and I had 4 miles left. At mile 6, the trail enters a section of old forest Douglas fir, some of them very large, the understory open and cathedral-like. It's the best-looking section of the trail, if I'm being honest. The light in there in the afternoon was slanted and amber, and the forest floor was deep in needles. I slowed down, the way you do in a place that feels like it wants you to slow down. I found the first handprint at about eye height on a large fir, maybe 15 feet from the trail. Burned into the bark? No, that's not right. The bark wasn't burned, but the impression was deep and permanent, as if something had pressed a hand flat against the tree with enormous, sustained force, leaving a clean impression in the wood beneath. I looked at the impression for a long time. It was large. Larger than my own hand when I held mine up to compare, larger than Walt's hand would have been, which I guessed was larger than mine. The fingers were long and slightly splayed, and the thumb was on the wrong side. I wrote it in my assessment notebook. Handprint impression, fir tree, mile 6.2, unusual, which is maybe the most inadequate notation I've ever made. I found 2 more continuing down the trail, each on a different tree. Each the same hand, same size, same wrong-sided thumb, each pressed into the wood at a height that would have required reaching, not quite stretching, but definitely conscious placement. I should have turned around. I was on a bounded trail with a clear route back, and I should have turned around. Instead, I finished the loop because turning around felt, I know this sounds irrational, it felt like it would make something pay attention, and completing the loop felt like performing normalcy in a situation where normalcy was possibly protective. I know that doesn't make sense. It made sense at the time. Coming down the eastern slope, about a mile from the trailhead, I looked up from the trail and saw it watching me. It was in the canopy. Not in the upper canopy, about 20 feet up in the mid-story, where the fir branches spread horizontal and wide. It was above and to the right of the trail, and it was facing down, watching me, and the body was arranged in the tree in a way that was nothing like how a person would sit in a tree, with the limbs splayed and the torso horizontal and the head angled down in a curve that should not have been possible along the axis the neck was bending. The face was turned toward me, and the face was too pale and too smooth, and the features were compressed toward the center in a way that reminded me involuntarily of something that had been pressed very hard against glass, the features flattened and pushed together. No expression, no movement. It watched me pass. I kept walking. I kept my eyes on the trail ahead of me. I put one foot in front of the other for a full mile, and I did not run, and I have no clear idea what instinct told me that running would have been the wrong choice, but I am fairly confident it was correct. I reached the trailhead. I drove to the ranger station. I handed Walt my assessment clipboard and said I'd found some unusual handprint impressions on the firs at mile 6, and that I thought he should add the Jepsen to the 2-week check schedule rather than the monthly. He looked at me for a moment and then looked at the clipboard and said, "Yeah." He said it like it wasn't new information. I finished my internship. I did not hike the Jepsen loop again. When I was packing my truck to leave Hollow Pines, I found in the outside pocket of my pack, a pocket I hadn't opened at all during the Jepsen hike, I was certain of it, a single fir needle, not remarkable in itself, except that it had been bent and folded into a specific shape, once in the middle and once at each end so that it formed a crude figure. Long body, 4 bent limbs, a head. I set it on my dashboard and drove away. I'm not sure why I kept it. Maybe because it was the only evidence I had, and even evidence I can't explain and don't want to think about too hard, felt better than the alternative, which was having nothing at all to show for what I'd seen. I still have it, in a small plastic bag at the bottom of a drawer I don't open often. Occasionally I take it out and look at it and think about what was in that tree. Then I put it back and close the drawer and go make something for dinner. And I try to be grateful that I walked and didn't run. Thanks for watching. If these stories got under your skin, hit that like button and subscribe. We share new stories every week, and the best ones are the ones that stay with you. Drop a comment below and tell me which story unsettled you most, and share this with someone who loves a good scare. Until next time, keep the lights on and stay safe out there.